Sitting across the table, Kevin Hahn watched Sora put down her wine glass with a cold, careful move. She had asked him to dinner tonight, saying it was important, though her voice had no warmth at all. 5 years together, and she picked a busy restaurant to end it so he couldn't get loud or upset. She told him plainly that she got a big promotion at Vantage Capital, moving into strategy work under the boss. She told him this relationship no longer fit where her life was going, as staying together felt like dead weight. Kevin asked what she meant by dead weight, though he already guessed the painful answer forming on her face. She said it without blinking, since he had no real career, no ambition worth naming, no future worth waiting for. She said working as a junior data analyst at a mid-size firm wasn't a career but just a placeholder job. She said she needed someone climbing, not someone comfortable, since comfortable had somehow become another word for worthless lately. Kevin sat in silence, taking in each sentence like a slow, steady wrecking ball hitting 5 solid years. He asked if this was really about ambition or about the new boss she kept mentioning for months now. Sora's face flickered, proving what he had quietly guessed, since this wasn't really about his career at all. It was about opportunity, about being close to power, about a man named Julian Cross who ran Vantage Capital. She didn't deny it directly but repeated that Kevin needed to understand this choice was about her future. Her future, she said again, deserved someone who already made it rather than someone still hoping to find his path. Kevin left the restaurant alone, walking through the cold night streets while playing her words over with growing sharp anger. No future. Deadweight. A placeholder. Each word looped through his mind, cutting deeper every time it repeated. He had spent 5 years backing her dreams as he cheered her promotions, thinking their bond meant building something together someday. Instead, she had simply been waiting for something better to show up, using him as a placeholder until it did. That night, alone in his apartment, Kevin opened his laptop and stared at his own quiet, unfinished career plans. He had always been careful, patient, and steady, things Sora had somehow mistaken for having no real drive. He thought about proving her wrong with a flashy title or a public win just to make her notice. Then he thought again, since being seen wasn't power and being noticed wasn't leverage either. What mattered was position and real control, not attention or applause. He remembered one detail from months of her talking, that Vantage Capital was quietly changing who owned the company. The current top owner, an aging founder named Richard Voss, was said to be looking to sell his shares privately.
Hey guys, sorry for mid-editing, but I noticed a lot of you are watching my videos without subscribing. Our subscribe ratio is literally close to 0. I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Thanks. Now, back to the recap.
Kevin sat with that detail a long time, turning it over slowly as an opportunity formed with sudden clarity. If he couldn't outclimb her inside Vantage Capital, he could simply become the ground she was climbing on. Kevin spent the next few weeks doing something quiet and slow, real research rather than angry venting or loud plans. He read everything public about Vantage Capital, its money, its clients, and the people who ran it day to day. He learned Richard Voss, the founder, was 71 years old and tired of fighting with his own board members. Voss held 60% of the company while the other 2 big investors held the rest and fought him often. Word in small finance circles said Voss wanted out soon since he wanted to retire and stop the constant boardroom fighting. Kevin also learned that Julian Cross, the new CEO Sora kept praising, was smart but not fully trusted yet. Cross had only been CEO for 8 months, brought in fast after the last CEO left under a cloud. Some board members liked him while others thought he was too young, too flashy, and not steady enough for real trust. This detail mattered since a company with a shaky new CEO and a tired founder was a company open to change. Kevin was not rich, as he had savings, a decent salary, and no way to simply buy a company outright. But he did not need to buy the whole company since he only needed a real seat at the table. He began looking for smaller private funds that specialized in buying stakes in companies just like this one. These funds did not need one person to have all the money since they pooled money from many smart investors. Kevin started reaching out carefully and quietly to people he had met over the years through work events. He was not asking for money yet, since he was asking for advice, for names, and for a way into the room. One contact, an old college friend named Priya, now worked at a small private equity fund downtown. She listened to Kevin's idea and told him plainly that funds like hers looked for exactly this kind of opportunity. An aging founder wanting out, a shaky new CEO, and internal fighting on the board was catnip for investors. She asked why Kevin, a data analyst with no finance background, wanted to get involved in something this big. Kevin gave her a simple answer, since he understood the company's data, its clients, and its daily operations very well. He had spent years quietly building spreadsheets and models on his own time just for fun, studying firms like this. Priya was surprised as she asked to see his work, and what she saw impressed her more than she expected. His models were sharp and careful, showing a real understanding of exactly where Vantage Capital was weak and strong. She told him that with the right pitch her fund might actually back him as part of a buying group. Kevin felt something shift inside him, not excitement exactly but something colder, steadier, and far more useful than excitement. Over the following month Kevin worked harder than he ever had, building a full plan to present to investors. He studied every public filing, every client list he could find, every clue about where Vantage Capital was heading. He built a model showing exactly how the company could grow faster with better leadership and clearer direction. He also built a second quieter document, a list of exactly what was going wrong under Julian Cross specifically. Missed targets, slow decisions, and a pattern of avoiding hard calls that the board had noticed but not yet acted on. Kevin was careful not to make this personal as he kept every note factual, sourced, and free of any anger. He knew that anger would make him look weak and unstable, exactly what people already assumed about him now. Priya reviewed his pitch twice, cutting out anything soft while sharpening every number and making the whole plan feel undeniable. She told him that Richard Voss the founder was the real key since if Voss trusted the plan the rest would follow. Getting a meeting with Voss directly was hard since he avoided most young strangers pitching him random business ideas. Priya used an old contact to get Kevin 15 minutes, framed simply as a courtesy meeting with nothing more promised. Kevin prepared for those 15 minutes like his entire future depended on them because in many ways it did. The meeting took place in a quiet old-fashioned office that still used paper folders instead of screens everywhere. Richard Voss was smaller than Kevin expected, sharp-eyed, and clearly used to people wasting his limited time badly. Kevin did not waste time as he laid out 3 problems inside Vantage Capital that Voss already privately suspected himself. Slow client onboarding, rising internal conflict, and a CEO more focused on image than on steady reliable performance. Voss listened without interrupting while his expression gave away nothing though his eyes stayed locked on Kevin the entire time. When Kevin finished Voss asked one simple question, why should he trust a stranger with no finance title at all? Kevin answered honestly since he had no title, no reputation, and nothing to protect except being right. He said that was exactly why his numbers were clean since he had no politics to manage, only facts to present. Voss sat back slowly, considering this answer for a long moment before finally speaking again with a quieter voice. He said most people who wanted into his company wanted status while Kevin seemed to want something else entirely. Kevin admitted carefully that he wanted control over his own future and this company was simply the fastest path there. Voss respected the honesty more than he expected to as the 15-minute meeting stretched into nearly an hour instead. 3 days later Priya called Kevin with news that made his chest tighten with something between fear and hope. Voss wanted to move forward, not with a full sale yet but with a smaller deal to test the waters. He would sell a meaningful chunk of his shares to Priya's fund with Kevin included as a named partner. It was not control yet since it was a foothold, a real seat at the table, and a name on real paperwork. Kevin signed documents that made his hands shake slightly, aware this was the first real step toward something permanent. He did not tell Sora anything yet since this was not about her attention but about being ready. Word moved slowly through the company at first, the way these things always do in careful financial circles. A new investor group had taken a stake while nobody outside the deal knew the names involved just yet.
Hey guys, sorry for mid-editing, but I noticed a lot of you are watching my videos without subscribing. Our subscribe ratio is literally close to 0. I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Thanks. Now, back to the recap.
Kevin kept his day job and his quiet life while letting the paperwork do its slow, patient work underground. He studied the company even harder now, no longer as an outsider but as someone with real skin in the game. He identified 2 board members who were quietly unhappy with Julian Cross's leadership but too cautious to say so loudly. He began building relationships with them carefully, offering data and insight without ever asking for anything in return yet. Trust, he had learned, was built slowly through small deposits of usefulness rather than through big dramatic gestures. Meanwhile at Vantage Capital, Sora's career kept climbing exactly as she had planned it from the very beginning. She got closer to Julian Cross as she was praised constantly in meetings and given bigger projects and treated like a rising star openly. She had no idea that somewhere in the building's ownership structure a name connected to her old boyfriend now existed. Kevin watched all of this from a careful distance, feeling no rush and no need to speed up his timeline. He had learned patience the hard way through years of being told he lacked ambition and drive entirely. Now that patience felt like a weapon, sharp and quiet, instead of a weakness people mocked so easily before. He thought of Sora occasionally, though the thought no longer burned the way it once had weeks earlier. It had cooled into something calmer and more focused, more like a plan than like pain anymore. He was not building this to hurt her specifically, since he was building this because he finally believed he deserved more. 6 months into his quiet involvement, Kevin's small group increased its stake again by buying more shares from tired minority holders. The 2 unhappy board members Kevin had built trust with began speaking more openly about their concerns with Cross. They cited missed targets, slow decisions, and a growing sense that Cross cared more about appearances than real results. Kevin, now attending occasional board-adjacent meetings as a fund representative, stayed quiet while letting others carry the loudest complaints. He offered data when asked, sharp and useful, always timed to support exactly the point being made at that moment. Slowly and carefully a coalition began forming, not against Sora but against Cross, whose leadership was becoming harder to defend. Kevin never once mentioned Sora's name in these meetings, since this was never about her and never needed to be. But he understood clearly that her rising star was tied directly to Cross's continued success at the company. If Cross fell, her fast climb would slow considerably without Kevin ever needing to say a single word against her. He simply needed to keep being useful, keep being right, and let the natural weight of facts do the rest. At a tense quarterly board meeting, the conflict finally came into the open, louder than it had ever been before. One board member openly questioned whether Cross was the right leader going forward, citing 3 straight quarters of missed goals. Cross defended himself forcefully, though his answers sounded increasingly rehearsed and thin against the sharp, specific data presented. Kevin sat quietly near the back of the room representing the fund while watching the moment unfold exactly as predicted. Richard Voss, still the largest shareholder even after selling some shares, watched everything with careful, unreadable old eyes. After the meeting, Voss pulled Kevin aside privately, asking directly what he thought should happen next with leadership. Kevin answered carefully and honestly, saying the company needed steadier hands focused on operations rather than image and appearance. He did not ask for the CEO job since he was not ready, and he knew it clearly himself. Instead, he suggested a respected operations veteran within the company, someone he had quietly gotten to know over months. Voss considered this suggestion seriously, recognizing it as advice from someone with no personal agenda attached to it. 2 weeks later, the board called a special meeting, one that everyone inside the company sensed was coming. Julian Cross arrived looking tired, as the confident shine he once carried was now replaced by something closer to worry. The board presented its case clearly: 3 quarters of missed targets, growing internal conflict, and shrinking client trust. Cross tried to defend himself, but the room had already made up its mind well before he spoke. Richard Voss spoke last with a calm but final voice, saying the company needed steadier leadership going forward rather than flash. Cross resigned that same day, choosing to leave quietly rather than fight a battle he clearly could not win. News spread through the company fast, shock rippling through every department within just a few short hours. Sora heard the news standing in the break room while her coffee cup froze halfway to her mouth in surprise. Her mentor, her path upward, her closest connection to power inside the company was simply gone overnight. She did not yet know who was behind the quiet moves that led to this sudden sharp collapse. She only knew her carefully built plan now had a cross-shaped hole right in the middle of it. The board moved quickly to name an interim leader, choosing the steady operations veteran Kevin had quietly suggested earlier. Her name was Grace Lynn, respected and careful, known for fixing problems quietly instead of chasing headlines or attention. Grace's first move was reviewing every department closely to see what actually worked and what had simply looked good. Sora's team, built heavily around Cross's flashy priorities, suddenly found itself under real scrutiny for the very first time. Projects that once seemed impressive under Cross now looked thin under Grace's steady, detail-focused leadership style. Sora tried adjusting quickly, shifting her language and her focus while trying to appear valuable under this very different kind of boss. It was harder than she expected, since Grace valued substance rather than charm, and substance was not Sora's strongest skill. Kevin, still working quietly behind the scenes as a fund representative, watched this shift with careful, distant interest. He felt no joy exactly, though something inside him did settle slightly seeing the structure change so completely. He was not doing this to watch Sora struggle specifically, since he was doing this to finally matter somewhere real. With Cross gone and Grace settling into leadership, Richard Voss called Kevin in for another private conversation. He told Kevin plainly that his read on the company had proven right, sharper than most people twice his age. He asked whether Kevin wanted a real operating role inside the company rather than just a quiet investor seat anymore. Kevin considered this carefully since taking a real role meant stepping into the light and no longer working from the shadows. He said yes, though he asked for a role built around strategy and data rather than flashy titles or public attention. Voss respected this choice, understanding exactly why someone burned by empty titles once would want something with real substance instead. Kevin was brought in as a senior strategy advisor reporting directly to Grace while working closely with every department. His first project involved reviewing team structures across the company, looking for waste, overlap, and misplaced priorities everywhere. This review naturally included Sora's department, the same one she had built her fast rise around for years. Kevin approached this task the same way he approached everything now, carefully and factually without personal feeling attached. He did not seek out Sora specifically since he simply reviewed every team the same fair, careful way each time. The day Sora learned who her new strategy reviewer was became one of the strangest moments of her entire career. She saw his name on a meeting invite and blinked twice, needing a full minute to confirm it was real. Kevin Hahn, her ex-boyfriend, now sitting inside Vantage Capital with a title that outranked her own position clearly. She walked into their scheduled meeting with her composure fighting hard against complete, total disorienting shock inside her chest. Kevin greeted her exactly the way he greeted every other manager that week, polite, professional, and completely unreadable. He did not smirk and he did not mention their past since he simply opened his laptop and began the review calmly. Sora tried to read his face for any sign of triumph or any hint of revenge and found absolutely nothing there. That absence unsettled her more than anger ever could have because anger would have at least felt familiar. Kevin asked about her team's recent project outcomes, her department's client retention numbers, and her actual measurable results. Sora answered as confidently as she could manage, though her usual charm felt strangely useless in this specific room. Over the following 2 weeks, Kevin reviewed every team at Vantage Capital with the same careful factual thoroughness. Sora's department, once celebrated under Cross for flashy client pitches, showed weaker actual retention numbers than most others. Clients were impressed initially, then often left within a year, unhappy with follow-through and long-term service quality. Kevin documented this clearly without editorial comment, letting the numbers speak the way Voss had once told him they should. He presented his findings to Grace privately first, walking through every department fairly, including his own funds-related interests. Grace reviewed the data carefully, asking sharp questions while testing Kevin's conclusions the same way she tested everyone else's work. She agreed with most of his findings, including the assessment that Sora's department needed real restructuring rather than just polish. This restructuring meant fewer flashy pitch-focused roles and more roles focused on long-term client relationship management instead. Sora's specific position, built around initial client charm rather than long-term account management, was directly affected by this shift. She was not fired, though her role was folded into a larger team as her authority was quietly reduced and her title adjusted downward. Sora requested a private meeting with Kevin, unable to simply accept this outcome without at least trying to understand why. Sitting across from him now in his office instead of a restaurant, the reversal felt almost impossible to process fully. She asked directly whether this was personal, whether he had done this deliberately to punish her for the breakup. Kevin answered honestly, explaining that her department's numbers spoke for themselves, documented clearly across a full year of data. He said he had reviewed every team the same way and hers simply had not held up under real scrutiny. Sora pressed further, asking how he had even ended up in this position at all with this much power. Kevin explained simply that he had studied the company, found real opportunity, and worked patiently to earn a genuine seat. He said this was not about proving her wrong specifically, since it was about finally building something real for himself. Sora sat with that answer for a long moment as something shifted uncomfortably behind her carefully controlled expression. She had once called him a man with no future, while now his name outranked hers on the company chart. What Sora did not know was how close Kevin had come to giving up entirely during those first difficult weeks. The night spent staring at spreadsheets, unsure if any of it would matter or if he was fooling himself completely. Priya had believed in him before he fully believed in himself, pushing him forward through moments of serious doubt. Richard Voss had taken a real risk trusting a stranger with no finance background over experienced credentialed candidates instead. None of this had been guaranteed, since none of this had been easy, quick, or the result of simple luck. Kevin had built it slowly, brick by brick, the same patient way Sora once mocked as having no ambition. She had mistaken patience for weakness, steadiness for lack of drive, and quiet confidence for having nothing worth offering. She had judged him by how loud his ambition sounded rather than by how solid his actual plans truly were. Now sitting in his office with a reduced title, she was finally seeing the cost of that specific mistake. Kevin felt no need to explain any of this to her directly since the results already spoke clearly enough themselves. Word spread quietly through the company about the strange history between the new strategy advisor and the demoted manager. Some colleagues found it fascinating, whispering theories about revenge, timing, and impossible story-worthy coincidence in hushed break-room conversations. Kevin ignored the gossip entirely, focusing instead on his growing responsibilities and the trust Grace continued placing in him. Grace, noticing his consistent careful work, began giving him larger projects to test his judgment on bigger company decisions. Kevin approached each new task the same way: thorough research first, clear data second, and personal feelings never involved. This approach earned him steady respect throughout the company, considerably different from the flashy popularity Cross once enjoyed briefly. People trusted Kevin because his conclusions consistently proved correct rather than because he was charming or exciting to be around. That kind of trust, he was learning, lasted considerably longer than charm ever could inside a real functioning company. He thought of Sora's old words less often now as the sting faded into something more like distant useful memory. He was no longer building anything to prove her wrong since he was simply continuing to build because building felt right. 3 months into his new role, Kevin met someone who would slowly change how he saw the whole situation. Her name was Mira Yun, a client relationship lead brought in fresh under Grace's rebuilt, more careful company structure. Mira was sharp, direct, and completely unimpressed by Kevin's growing reputation, treating him like any other coworker entirely. Their first real conversation happened over a shared project, arguing calmly about the best way to handle a difficult client. Kevin found himself enjoying the disagreement, something he rarely felt with people who usually just agreed with him now. Mira did not know about his history with Sora at first, and Kevin did not feel any need to explain it. Over the following weeks, their working relationship slowly grew into something warmer, built through honest, easy, low-pressure conversation. Kevin noticed something different about how Mira treated him compared to how Sora once had years earlier. Mira asked about his ideas, his weekend plans, and his actual opinions rather than just his usefulness or his rising position. She seemed genuinely interested in him as a person rather than in what he represented or what he could offer her. One evening, working late together on a shared report, Mira asked him directly about the office gossip she had heard. She asked plainly whether it was true that his ex-girlfriend now worked 2 floors below his new office. Kevin considered lying or deflecting, then decided honesty felt easier and more comfortable than managing another careful performance. He told her the whole story simply and without drama, including the exact words Sora had once said to him. Mira listened quietly as her expression shifted from curiosity into something closer to quiet, genuine anger on his behalf. She said plainly that anyone who called him a man with no future clearly had no idea what they were looking at. Kevin felt something warm settle in his chest, different from the cold satisfaction he usually felt about his career. This felt simpler, softer, and considerably more human than any victory over Sora ever could have felt alone. He realized sitting there that he had spent months building power and had almost forgotten to build connection too. Mira, without meaning to, was slowly teaching him that both things could matter at the exact same time. Struggling under her reduced role, Sora began looking for ways to rebuild her standing within the restructured company. She requested a meeting with Grace directly, hoping to present a plan showing her value beyond her old flashy pitches. Grace listened fairly, giving Sora genuine room to prove herself and judging only by results rather than past reputation. Sora worked harder than she ever had, focusing on actual client retention instead of just impressive first impressions. Slowly her numbers began improving, proving she did have real ability once she focused on the right things. Kevin noticed this improvement during his ongoing department reviews, documenting it fairly exactly as he documented everyone else's progress. He gave credit where it was earned without personal warmth but also without any lingering unfairness or hidden punishment. Sora noticed this fairness too, and it confused her more than outright hostility from him ever could have. She had expected him to quietly sabotage her further given their history and the obvious power he now held. Instead, he simply treated her like any other employee, judged only by her actual measurable performance and results. One afternoon, Sora approached Kevin privately, asking why he had not used his position to push her out completely. Kevin answered simply, explaining that using his position that way would make him no better than the games she once played. He said his goal had never been revenge specifically since it was only building something real that finally reflected his actual worth. Sora absorbed this answer slowly, recognizing something in it that unsettled her more than any anger could have. He was not cruel and he was not petty since he was simply, completely, no longer affected by her opinion at all. That realization landed harder than any insult because it meant her old words truly held no power over him anymore. She asked quietly whether he still hated her for what she had said that night at dinner months earlier. Kevin considered the question honestly before answering that hate required energy he no longer wanted to spend on her. He said he did not hate her since he simply no longer needed anything from her, including her forgiveness or approval. Sora left that conversation feeling something she had not expected to feel, genuine, quiet, humbling respect for him. Kevin and Myra's relationship continued growing naturally, built through honest conversation rather than any grand dramatic gesture. He introduced her to Priya, who approved instantly, recognizing genuine warmth in how Mira treated Kevin day to day. Richard Voss, now semi-retired but still watching the company closely, noticed Kevin's continued sharp, careful, reliable judgment. He began inviting Kevin to more strategic conversations, treating him less like a junior advisor and more like a real partner. Grace, running the company steadily, promoted Kevin formally into a senior leadership role within the first year. His title now carried real weight, earned entirely through demonstrated results rather than any flashy promise or empty charm. Kevin thought back occasionally to that cold dinner conversation, though the memory had lost almost all its old sting. He no longer needed Sora to see his success since his success simply existed now independent of her opinion entirely. Mira asked him once whether he ever planned to tell Sora exactly how far he had come since that dinner. Kevin said no, not because he was hiding anything but because Sora already saw it clearly every single day at work. There was nothing left to prove since the company org chart already said everything that needed saying between them now. A year after the breakup, Kevin proposed to Mira during a quiet weekend trip, choosing simplicity over any spectacle. Mira said yes immediately, moved by how genuine and unhurried the moment felt compared to typical dramatic proposals. Their wedding was small, intentional, and filled only with people who genuinely mattered to both of them personally. Sora was not invited, not out of cruelty but because she simply no longer belonged in that part of his life. Kevin felt no guilt about this since some doors simply closed naturally once people moved into genuinely different directions. Watching Mira across the room during their small celebration, Kevin felt a kind of peace he had not expected finding. This peace had nothing to do with beating Sora, outranking her, or proving any old painful point correct. It had everything to do with finally building a life he was genuinely proud of for himself and by himself. The company, the title, and the respect all mattered, though none of it mattered as much as this. He had been called a man with no future once, while now he simply lived one quietly and completely. Before stepping back fully, Richard Voss asked Kevin to walk with him through the old office one last time. He told Kevin something he had never shared before about his own early days building the company from nothing. He said everyone doubted him too back when he was young, quiet, and had no money worth mentioning either. He said the loudest people in any room rarely build the most lasting things, though they get noticed first. Quiet people, he said, build slower, but what they build tends to last longer, standing after the noise fades. Kevin listened carefully, recognizing pieces of his own story reflected back through an old man's careful, hard-earned wisdom. Richard told him one final thing before leaving that day, something Kevin would carry with him for years afterward. He said real success was never about making one person regret leaving you since it was about becoming someone worth staying for. Kevin nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind those simple plain words more than he expected to at first. He shook Richard's hand, thanked him honestly, and watched the old founder walk out of the building for the last time. That evening Kevin sat with Mira sharing the conversation while turning Richard's words over slowly in his own mind. Mira asked whether he still thought about Sora often, curious rather than jealous and comfortable enough to ask directly. Kevin admitted he thought about her rarely now, and when he did it felt more like remembering a lesson than a wound. He said her words that night had been cruel, though cruelty sometimes taught things kindness never could have taught him. Mira agreed, though she added that cruelty should never be required for growth even if it sometimes accidentally caused it. Kevin considered this carefully, recognizing the truth in her gentle correction while appreciating her honesty as he always did. He said he hoped, if they ever had children, they would never need someone's cruelty to discover their own strength. Mira smiled, saying that was exactly the kind of hope worth building a life around, together and patiently and honestly. They sat together quietly that evening, comfortable in a way Kevin had never quite felt with anyone before her. This comfort, built slowly through honesty rather than performance, felt like the real prize hidden inside his whole journey. Over the following 2 years, Sora kept working steadily, slowly rebuilding a version of herself built on real substance. She stopped chasing flashy wins and started focusing on long-term client relationships, the boring patient work she once avoided. Her numbers improved gradually, not dramatically, but steadily enough that even skeptical colleagues began noticing real lasting change. Grace, still CEO, noticed this shift too and occasionally offered Sora small opportunities to prove her growing genuine reliability. Sora took each opportunity seriously, no longer performing ambition for an audience since she simply did careful, honest work instead. She thought about Kevin sometimes with a strange mix of respect and quiet, uncomfortable embarrassment about that dinner. She never apologized to him again after that first attempt, sensing correctly that another apology would feel more performative than real. Instead, she let her changed behavior speak for itself, the same lesson Kevin had learned and quietly modeled for years. Slowly, without any dramatic announcement, she became someone considerably steadier than the woman who once measured people by titles alone. She still wanted success and still wanted to climb, though now she wanted it built on something real underneath it. One afternoon, Sora found herself in a meeting where Kevin presented a new company strategy to senior staff. She watched him speak, calm and clear, entirely focused on the actual plan rather than on impressing anyone in the room. She remembered briefly the version of him she once dismissed so easily across that restaurant table years earlier. She realized with quiet discomfort that she had never actually known him at all back then, not really. She had only known the surface, the job title, and the visible ambition, never the patient depth underneath it all. After the meeting, she approached him briefly, thanking him for his clear presentation while keeping the interaction simple and professional. Kevin thanked her back, equally simple and equally professional, with no lingering tension visible in either of their careful expressions. Walking away, Sora felt something settle inside her chest, not quite peace but something close to honest acceptance finally. She had been wrong about him and she could admit that now quietly without needing him to know it directly. That private admission, small as it seemed, marked real growth in a woman who once needed to always be right. By the third year after the acquisition, Vantage Capital had grown into something considerably stronger than it once was. Client numbers increased steadily, employee turnover dropped, and the company's reputation shifted from flashy and unstable towards steady and trusted. Kevin's approach to leadership, careful and fact-based, had become a model other executives in the company tried to copy. He mentored several younger employees, teaching them the same patient research skills that had once quietly changed his entire life. He told them clearly that ambition did not need to be loud to be real since patience was not weakness. He told them the people who doubted them loudest often simply lacked the patience to build anything real themselves. Grace relied on him heavily for major decisions, trusting his judgment the same way Richard Voss once learned to trust it. Their partnership, built on honesty and shared values, became the steady foundation the entire company operated around confidently. Kevin occasionally thought back to that first 15-minute meeting with Richard, nervous and unsure if any of it would work. He never forgot how close he had come to simply giving up during those uncertain early weeks of quiet planning. Priya, still running her fund, remained a close friend and advisor, having profited considerably from her early bet on Kevin. She often told other young founders about Kevin's story, using it as proof that quiet, careful people could win too. She never mentioned Sora's name specifically, keeping that detail private while respecting Kevin's wish to keep his personal history separate. Kevin appreciated this discretion greatly, never wanting his success framed publicly as revenge against anyone specifically at all. He wanted it framed simply as proof that patient, honest work eventually outperformed loud, flashy, unstable ambition every time. This framing mattered enormously to him, shaping how he mentored others and how he thought about his own legacy. He did not want to be remembered as the man who got revenge on his ex-girlfriend through a company buyout. He wanted to be remembered as the man who finally believed in his own quiet, patient, underestimated strength. That distinction, subtle but important, guided every decision he made as his role and influence continued growing steadily. He had built something real since real things, he had learned, needed honest foundations rather than bitter, resentful ones. 5 years after that cold dinner, Kevin stood in his office overlooking the city, reviewing quarterly results calmly. Vantage Capital had grown steadily under Grace's leadership, with Kevin now serving as her most trusted senior partner. His and Myra's daughter, born the previous year, sat in a small photo frame on his tidy desk. Sora still worked at the company, settled comfortably into a mid-level role that suited her actual honest skills. She had grown into someone considerably more grounded than the woman who once called him dead weight at dinner. They occasionally crossed paths in meetings, treating each other with the plain professional respect of experienced colleagues. Neither brought up the past since it simply did not matter anymore, buried under years of separate different growth. Kevin sometimes thought about how differently things might have gone if she had never said those specific words. Perhaps he would have stayed comfortable and unchallenged, never discovering the patient, careful strength he actually carried inside himself. In a strange way, her cruelty had accidentally handed him the exact push he needed to finally begin building. Richard Voss, fully retired now, occasionally visited the office while always making time to check in with Kevin personally. He once told Kevin that betting on him that day remained one of his best decisions in 50 years of business. Kevin thanked him honestly, admitting he had been terrified during that very first 15-minute meeting years earlier. Voss laughed, saying real courage never feels like confidence since it simply feels like doing the necessary thing anyway. Kevin carried that lesson forward, mentoring a few younger employees the same patient way Priya once mentored him. He taught them that ambition did not need to be loud to be real, that quiet patient building counted too. He taught them that the people who doubt you loudest often simply cannot imagine patience as a real strength. Mira, now working part-time while raising their daughter, remained his steadiest, most honest source of counsel and comfort. Watching his daughter grow, Kevin hoped she would never need someone else's cruelty to discover her own quiet strength. But he also knew that if she ever did, she came from someone who had proven it entirely possible. Flashback: what really happened during the deal? Looking back now, 5 years later, Kevin sometimes retold pieces of this story to his mates, the parts nobody outside the deal ever saw. Part 18. The first warning sign. Going back to those early weeks, before anyone knew Kevin's plan, there was a moment that almost stopped everything. Priya called him one evening with a tight voice, saying one of the smaller investors had gotten cold feet suddenly. This investor, a cautious man named Deshi, worried that a data analyst with no finance background was too big a risk. He threatened to pull his share of the money, which would have left the whole group short of what they needed. Kevin felt his stomach drop hearing this news, sensing weeks of careful work could collapse over one nervous phone call. He asked Priya for one thing: a chance to speak with Deshi directly instead of losing him quietly by phone. Priya arranged a short meeting the next day, though she warned Kevin that Deshi rarely changed his mind once worried. Kevin spent that whole night preparing, not a new pitch but a clear, honest answer to the exact fear driving Deshi. He printed his research again, every number and every source laid out plainly so a nervous man could check it himself. He decided the answer to fear was never more excitement, since the answer to fear was always more proof. Sitting across from Deshi the next morning, Kevin did not try to sound confident or impressive in any way. He simply said Deshi was right to be careful and that being careful was exactly why he should stay in. He walked through every number slowly, letting Deshi ask hard questions while answering each one without getting defensive or rushed. Deshi tested him on client numbers, on staff turnover, and on exactly how sure Kevin was that Richard wanted to sell. Kevin answered each question honestly, admitting the parts he was not fully sure about instead of pretending certainty everywhere. This honesty, more than any number, seemed to settle something in Deshi's mind over the course of that hour. Deshi finally said he would stay in, not because he loved the plan but because he trusted the process now. He said most young men facing doubt either got louder or disappeared, while Kevin had simply gotten more careful instead. Walking out of that meeting, Kevin understood something new about this whole plan, that it could fail at any moment. That fear did not stop him, since it simply made him more careful with every single step that followed after. A few weeks into the process, Kevin's group learned that a large regional bank had also approached Richard Voss quietly. This bank offered nearly double what Kevin's group could realistically match, backed by deep pockets and a famous name. Priya told Kevin plainly that most sellers, no matter how sentimental, eventually chose the biggest number on the page. Kevin felt real fear for the first time since starting this plan, understanding money alone could end everything quickly. He thought about giving up and about accepting that some fights simply could not be won by patience and research alone. Then he remembered Richard's file, the one detail that mattered more than most people realized about this specific man. Richard had built Vantage Capital from nothing, hiring almost every senior staff member personally over more than 20 years. He treated the company like a family rather than just a business, checking in personally with employees during hard times. A big bank buying him out would almost certainly mean layoffs, rebranding, and the slow erasing of everything Richard built. Kevin decided his only real advantage was not money, since it was understanding exactly what Richard actually cared about most. He wrote Richard a second letter, shorter than the first and focused entirely on people instead of numbers this time. He named specific employees by title, describing what would likely happen to their roles under a big bank's usual playbook. He did not guess wildly, since he had researched exactly how that same bank had handled 3 previous acquisitions before. Every time, jobs disappeared quietly within the first year, hidden behind polite language about efficiency and restructuring. Technically speaking, Kevin included this research plainly, letting Richard draw his own conclusions without pushing too hard or sounding desperate himself. He ended the letter simply, saying his group could not match the bank's price but only its respect for what Richard built. Richard's assistant called 2 days later, asking Kevin to come in for another meeting with a noticeably more serious tone. Sitting across from Richard again, Kevin sensed something had shifted, though he stayed calm and refused to celebrate too early. Richard admitted the bank's offer was tempting purely on paper, though something about it had bothered him from the start. He said money could replace itself, while trust, once broken by people who never really cared, usually could not be rebuilt. Richard told Kevin he needed one more thing before deciding anything final, something beyond letters and printed research pages. He wanted to see how Kevin actually behaved under real pressure rather than just how well he could write things down. He invited Kevin to sit quietly in the back of an actual board meeting, watching real problems unfold in real time. Kevin agreed immediately, understanding this was not a formality since this was the real test hiding behind every polite conversation. The meeting was tense as two board members argued sharply about a client complaint that had gone public online recently. Julian Cross, still CEO at that point, handled it poorly by getting defensive instead of addressing the actual problem directly. Kevin said nothing during the meeting exactly as instructed while simply watching, taking mental notes, and staying completely still and quiet. Afterward, Richard asked him privately what he had noticed, testing whether Kevin's earlier writing matched his real quiet judgment. Kevin answered carefully, saying Cross had defended his ego instead of defending the client relationship, a costly common mistake. He said the actual fix was simple, a direct apology and a fast visible change rather than more clever explanations. Richard listened and nodded slowly, recognizing the same clear thinking from the letters now showing up in real conversation too. He told Kevin plainly that this was the difference between someone who sounded smart and someone who actually was smart. 2 days later, Richard called Priya directly, telling her his decision had been made and it was not the bank. He wanted Kevin's group at a fair price, structured carefully to protect staff and preserve the company's culture properly. The bank's team was furious, offering to raise their bid further though Richard refused to even discuss numbers again. He told them plainly that some things were not actually for sale no matter how large the check became. Kevin received the news standing in his small apartment kitchen, the same kitchen where his life had once been ended. He sat down slowly, feeling something he had not expected to feel this strongly, not triumph but quiet solid relief. Months of careful, patient, unglamorous work had finally turned into something real, something he could actually hold on to now. He picked up his phone to call Priya back with hands steadier now than they had been in weeks. The final signing took place in a quiet law office, far from any press attention or public announcement of any kind. Kevin sat beside Priya and 2 other investors, watching Richard sign the last page with a steady, practiced hand. Nobody clapped and nobody celebrated loudly since it was simply paper moving from one set of hands into another set entirely. Afterward, Richard shook Kevin's hand a final time, holding it a moment longer than a normal polite business handshake would. He said something quiet, meant only for Kevin, about hoping he would remember this feeling once things got easier later. Kevin promised he would, though he did not yet fully understand how important that promise would become in future years. Walking outside afterward, Kevin stood on the sidewalk for a long moment while letting the reality settle slowly into his chest. He was, as of that signature, part owner of the very company his ex-girlfriend worked at every single day. He did not feel like celebrating with noise since he felt like sitting quietly somewhere and simply breathing for a while. He went home, made a simple dinner, and sat alone with his thoughts instead of calling anyone right away. The next morning he arrived at Vantage Capital early, before most employees, with a badge freshly printed with his actual real name. He walked through the lobby slowly, recognizing faces he had only seen before in company photos and public filings. Nobody knew who he was yet since to them he looked like just another new employee arriving for a normal workday. He rode the elevator up quietly, stepping out onto a floor that would soon become considerably more familiar to him. Somewhere on this same floor, Sora was likely already at her desk, unaware her ex-boyfriend now technically owned part of it. Kevin did not seek her out that first day since there was no rush left inside him anymore, only patience. He had learned through this entire long process that the best moves were rarely loud or immediate ones. He simply began working, quietly and carefully, the same way he had built everything that brought him to this exact point. Whatever happened next would happen on its own time, built the same slow, steady way everything else had been. He was no longer in a hurry to prove anything since he had already proven it quietly to himself first. That same week, unaware of anything happening around her, Sora prepared for a big client pitch she had spent days polishing. She felt good about her position, confident that her closeness to Julian Cross would keep protecting her rising career path. She had heard whispers about new investors joining the company, though nobody seemed to know real names or real details yet. She assumed, like most employees, that this meant nothing personal since it was just normal business movement happening somewhere far above her level. She spent that morning rehearsing her pitch in the mirror, checking her notes, and feeling the same old familiar confidence return. She walked into the client meeting focused entirely on herself, on her performance, and on how impressive she could appear today. The pitch went well as the client seemed pleased and Julian congratulated her afterward, praising her sharp thinking in front of others. She felt that afternoon like everything in her life was exactly where she had planned for it to be. She had no idea that 2 floors below, paperwork carrying Kevin's name was already being reviewed by company lawyers quietly. She had no idea her entire comfortable world was about to shift beneath her without any warning at all. That evening, celebrating quietly with a few coworkers, Sora allowed herself a rare moment of full relaxed satisfaction. She thought briefly about Kevin, wondering distantly what he might be doing now and whether he had found direction yet. She felt no real guilt, only a distant mild curiosity, the kind reserved for people who no longer mattered much. She genuinely believed she had made the right call that night at dinner, choosing ambition over comfortable quiet stability. She raised her glass with coworkers, toasting her own bright future, unaware how soon that future would start reporting elsewhere. Kevin, at that exact same hour, sat quietly at home reviewing onboarding paperwork for his first official week as owner. Neither of them knew how close their paths were about to come nor how differently each would experience that closeness. Sora slept peacefully that night, confident and secure, dreaming of further promotions and further proximity to real power. Kevin slept lightly, aware that tomorrow marked a real beginning, though he still felt strangely calm about it all. 2 very different nights, shaped by 2 very different choices, quietly converging toward the exact same building. 3 weeks after the deal closed, Grace, still adjusting to her new leadership role, reviewed the full investor list carefully. She noticed one name she did not immediately recognize among the smaller shareholders listed within the new ownership structure. Kevin Hahn, junior data analyst turned investor. She read the note twice, curious how someone with that title got here. She asked Priya about him directly, wanting to understand exactly who she was now formally accountable to as CEO. Priya explained carefully, without revealing every personal detail, that Kevin had done exceptional research and earned real investor trust. She mentioned briefly that he actually still worked as an analyst somewhere else, unaware most staff at Vantage Capital yet. Grace found this unusual, though she respected unusual paths, having taken a non-traditional route into leadership herself years earlier. She requested a meeting with Kevin directly, wanting to understand his thinking before any public introduction happened company-wide. Kevin arrived at that meeting still slightly nervous, aware Grace's respect would matter enormously for his future involvement here. Grace asked him bluntly why he wanted this specific company out of every struggling company he could have chosen instead. Kevin considered his answer carefully, deciding honesty mattered more here than any polished rehearsed investor pitch might. He said he had studied Vantage Capital because he understood parts of it personally, having once been close to someone here. He did not name Sora directly, keeping the detail vague while respecting both his own privacy and hers within this workplace. He said watching this company from the outside had taught him things about structure, patience, and where value truly lived. Grace studied him for a long moment, recognizing something familiar in his careful, thoughtful, slightly guarded way of speaking. She said she respected people who did not need loud stories to explain quiet, well-reasoned decisions like this one. She told him she intended to bring him in formally soon, giving him real responsibility instead of a silent background role. Kevin thanked her, admitting quietly that he had wondered whether he was even ready for something this visible yet. Grace told him readiness rarely felt like readiness, since it usually just felt like doing the next necessary thing anyway. Kevin left that meeting with the same steady, focused feeling he had carried since that very first meeting with Richard. Later that same week, Priya finally asked Kevin the question she had been holding back since their very first meeting. She asked plainly whether his interest in this specific company connected somehow to the breakup he had mentioned once briefly. Kevin hesitated, then decided Priya deserved the full truth given everything she had risked backing him from the very start. He told her about the dinner, about Sora's exact words, and about the sting that had refused to leave him alone. He admitted the original spark behind this whole plan had been anger, though it had slowly turned into something else. Priya listened without judgment while nodding slowly, having seen this pattern before in other founders she had worked with previously. She told him honestly that plenty of great companies started from someone's wounded pride and that this alone wasn't shameful. What mattered, she said, was whether he let that anger control every decision or whether he grew past it eventually. She said the version of him sitting in front of her now did not sound driven by anger anymore. He sounded driven by something steadier, something that had outlasted the original wound and built its own separate direction. Kevin appreciated her honesty, admitting he had worried quietly that this whole plan made him look petty or small. Priya disagreed firmly, saying pettiness would have meant humiliating Sora publicly, and he had never once tried to do that. She pointed out he had never leaked her name, never told the story around the office, never sought public revenge. He had simply built something real and let the natural structure of ownership speak for itself without any cruelty attached. That distinction, she said, mattered enormously, separating quiet ambition from petty small-minded revenge that would have eventually embarrassed him. Kevin sat with that observation for a long moment, recognizing he had never fully given himself credit for that restraint. He had been so focused on building that he had not noticed how carefully he had avoided cruelty throughout. Priya told him that restraint, more than the deal itself, was probably the thing he should feel proudest of. Kevin nodded slowly, filing that thought away carefully the same way he filed every useful piece of advice. He left that conversation feeling lighter somehow, as if a small weight he had been carrying quietly finally eased. 2 months into his new formal role, Kevin passed Sora in the hallway for the first time since everything changed. She was heading to a meeting with papers in hand, moving with her usual brisk, confident, purposeful walk down the corridor. She glanced up, recognized him instantly, and stopped completely still while her papers nearly slipped from her suddenly loose grip. Kevin nodded politely, the same nod he gave any colleague passing through the hallway during a normal workday. Sora opened her mouth and closed it again, clearly struggling to find any appropriate words for this exact strange moment. Kevin simply said good morning, calm and even, before continuing toward his own meeting without lingering or making it awkward. Sora stood frozen for several seconds after he passed, replaying the moment while trying to understand what she had just felt. There was no smugness in his voice and no hidden message since it was just a normal polite greeting between two working colleagues. Somehow that neutrality unsettled her far more than any dramatic confrontation or angry outburst ever could have managed. She had spent weeks imagining how this moment might go and reality had given her nothing to actually react against. She walked into her meeting late and distracted, unable to fully focus on the client numbers in front of her. Her colleague asked if she was all right and she simply nodded, saying she had just seen someone unexpected in the hallway. She did not explain further, unwilling to turn her private history into hallway gossip material for curious coworkers to enjoy. That night, alone in her apartment, she finally allowed herself to sit with the full weight of the situation honestly. The man she had once called someone with no future now walked these halls with more real power than she had. She thought about every word she had said that night at dinner, replaying them with fresh, uncomfortable clarity now. She had been so certain and so confident delivering those judgments like simple obvious facts rather than cruel, careless guesses. She realized slowly and painfully that she had judged an entire person based on one visible job title alone. She had missed everything underneath, the patience, the quiet intelligence, and the steady work ethic hidden behind his calm exterior. That realization did not arrive as one dramatic moment since it arrived slowly and quietly, the same patient way Kevin built everything. Around this same period, Kevin's working relationship with Mina began developing into something considerably more personal and meaningful. He had noticed her sharp thinking from their very first disagreement, though he had not yet considered anything beyond professional respect. One evening, working late on a joint project, they ended up grabbing dinner together simply to keep the conversation going. Neither treated it as a date exactly, though both privately noticed how easily their conversation moved beyond work matters. Mina asked him directly over that dinner why he seemed so calm about everything happening at the company lately. Kevin considered deflecting, then decided her honesty deserved honesty back, the same principle guiding most of his important decisions. He told her the short version of his story, the breakup, the plan, and the quiet years of careful building. Mina listened intently, asking sharp, thoughtful questions instead of offering easy sympathy or exaggerated dramatic reactions to his story. She asked whether he still felt angry, and Kevin admitted honestly that the anger had faded into something quieter now. She said that sounded healthier than most stories like this usually ended up sounding, and she meant it as real respect. Their dinner stretched much longer than either expected, with conversation moving easily between work topics and more personal, honest territory. Kevin found himself genuinely curious about her life too, asking questions instead of simply waiting for his turn to speak. Mina shared her own story about leaving a difficult previous job where her ideas were constantly dismissed by senior leadership. She said she had joined Vantage Capital hoping for a workplace that valued substance over charm and results over flashy presentation. Kevin recognized immediately how well that hope aligned with the exact culture he and Grace were trying to build together. Walking her to her car afterward, Kevin felt something he had not felt in a long time, genuine, uncomplicated interest. He did not rush anything, remembering clearly how rushing had never once served him well throughout this entire journey. He simply said he had enjoyed the conversation and hoped they could do it again sometime, keeping things easy and unforced. Mina agreed and smiled, saying she would actually look forward to that more than she expected to admit out loud. Driving home that night, Kevin allowed himself a small private smile, something rare and genuinely uncomplicated after months of pressure. A few weeks after the awkward hallway moment, Sora made one final attempt to smooth things over with Kevin directly. She sent a short, careful message asking if he had time for coffee, framing it as simply catching up professionally. Kevin considered ignoring it, then decided a short, honest conversation would probably close this chapter better than silence would. They met at a small coffee shop near the office, neutral ground, neither person's usual territory or comfort zone. Sora started by apologizing again, this time with less performance and more genuine discomfort visible in her careful expression. She admitted she had thought about that dinner often, especially since learning the full extent of what he had built. Kevin listened patiently, letting her speak without interrupting, the same patience that had carried him through this entire journey. When she finished, he told her plainly that he appreciated the apology, though he no longer needed it for himself. He said he had made peace with that night a long time ago, using it as fuel rather than wound. He said the only thing he wanted from her now was simple, honest, professional respect, Nothing more and nothing less. Sora asked hesitantly whether he had done all of this specifically to make her regret leaving him that night. Kevin considered the question seriously before answering, wanting to give her something true rather than something simply comfortable to hear. He said her words had been the spark, though the fire had grown into something bigger than her specifically. He said somewhere during the process this had stopped being about her and started being about who he wanted to become. Sora sat with that answer, recognizing it as more honest than she had expected and harder to argue against. She admitted quietly that she had underestimated him completely, mistaking his quiet nature for a lack of real ambition. Kevin nodded, saying that mistake was common and he no longer held it against her personally at all. He said everyone underestimates someone at some point and the real test was what a person did with that afterward. They finished their coffee in a strange calm silence, two people finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. Walking out of that coffee shop, both felt something close, though not identical, to genuine closure settling in. As Vantage Capital continued stabilizing under Grace's leadership, Kevin began informally mentoring a few younger analysts at the company. He noticed a pattern among them, the same pattern he once carried himself before that difficult defining dinner years earlier. Smart, careful people, often overlooked because they were quiet, preferred data over flashy, loud self-promotion constantly. He started meeting with them weekly, teaching them how to build the same kind of careful research he once built alone. He taught them to look past a company's surface to find the real story hiding underneath public numbers and reports. He taught them that patience was not the same as passivity since quiet work could still lead to real visible results. One young analyst, a nervous woman named Jiyoon, reminded Kevin sharply of himself during those very first uncertain weeks. She doubted her own ideas constantly, assuming louder colleagues automatically knew more simply because they spoke with more confidence. Kevin worked with her patiently, reviewing her research and pointing out exactly where her thinking was already sharper than she realized. Slowly, over months, Jiyoon grew more confident as her work improved steadily under his same careful, honest style of guidance. Watching her grow reminded Kevin of Priya and how much her early belief in him had genuinely mattered during his own journey. He understood now, more clearly than before, that someone's early belief could change the entire direction of another person's life. He made a quiet promise to himself to keep offering that same belief to others the same way it was once offered to him. This mentorship became, over time, one of the most meaningful parts of his growing role at the company overall. It was not flashy since it did not appear in headlines or company newsletters celebrating big visible wins publicly. But it mattered quietly, the same way most of the important things in Kevin's own story had mattered quietly too. Grace noticed this pattern in him, remarking once that he was building people as carefully as he had built the deal itself. Kevin appreciated the observation, recognizing it as one of the truest things anyone had said about his approach yet. He was no longer simply building a career or proving a point to someone from his past anymore. He was building a way of working that he genuinely believed in, and that belief felt like the real foundation now. 2 years into his role, Kevin faced his first truly difficult decision as a senior voice within the company's leadership. A major client threatened to leave unless the company cut costs by reducing staff in one specific smaller department. The easy answer was obvious: cut the smaller team, keep the big client happy, and protect the company's overall revenue. Kevin reviewed the numbers carefully, the same way he reviewed everything, refusing to let pressure rush his careful thinking process. He discovered the smaller department was actually profitable on its own, just quieter and less visible than flashier teams. He also discovered the demanding client's own behavior had caused several of the recent problems being blamed on staff. This was a harder truth to present since it meant pushing back against a client rather than simply following easy instructions. Kevin brought his findings to Grace, laying out both the numbers and the harder, more complicated truth underneath them. Grace listened carefully, asking sharp questions while testing his conclusions the same way she tested every important decision presented to her. She agreed with his assessment, deciding to address the client's behavior directly instead of simply cutting innocent staff members. This decision was risky since the client could still leave, taking significant revenue with them if they felt challenged too directly. Kevin helped draft the careful, respectful message to the client, outlining specific, fair expectations going forward from both sides. The client, surprised by the direct but respectful pushback, actually responded well, appreciating being treated as a partner rather than simply managed. The relationship improved instead of ending, and the smaller department kept its jobs, vindicated by careful, patient research once again. This outcome reinforced something Kevin had believed for years now, that the easy answer was rarely the correct answer. Real leadership, he was learning, often meant doing the harder, more honest thing instead of the faster, more comfortable thing. Sora, hearing about this decision through office conversation, found herself once again quietly impressed by his steady, careful approach. She no longer felt threatened by his growing influence since she simply recognized it as earned through real work consistently applied. That recognition, small as it seemed, marked real progress in how completely her view of him had changed over time. She had once seen him as someone with no future, while now she saw him as someone building the company's actual future. Over the following months, Kevin and Mina's relationship deepened steadily, built through the same patient honesty defining everything else. They spent weekends exploring the city together, having quiet, easy conversations that never once felt forced or performed for show. Mina met Priya eventually, and the two women got along immediately, bonding over their shared respect for Kevin's careful, steady character. Priya later told Kevin privately that Mina reminded her of the version of himself he had grown into over years. Someone who valued substance completely, who never needed loud declarations to prove genuine, deeply rooted feelings underneath everything. Kevin agreed, recognizing that quality in Mina immediately, the same quality that had drawn him toward trusting her early on. He found himself, for the first time in years, imagining a future that felt exciting rather than simply necessary or planned. With Sora, the future had always felt like something to prove, something to earn through visible, measurable external achievement. With Mina, the future felt like something to simply build together, patiently, without needing to prove anything to anyone else. That distinction, subtle but enormous, told Kevin more about the health of this relationship than any single conversation could. One evening, sitting together on Mina's small apartment balcony, Kevin found himself sharing something he had never said aloud before. He told her that for years he had measured his own worth by how visibly successful he appeared to others. He said meeting her had slowly taught him that genuine worth had very little to do with visibility at all. Mina listened quietly, then told him something equally honest, admitting she had once believed similar things about her own career. She said working under leaders who valued appearance over substance had nearly convinced her that substance alone was not enough. Meeting Kevin, seeing him succeed through quiet substance specifically, had renewed her belief that her original instincts had been correct. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, two people who had each found validation in the other's steady example. Kevin reached for her hand, feeling something settle completely inside his chest, calm and certain and genuinely quietly happy. This happiness, built slowly through shared values rather than shared ambition, felt like the truest prize inside his entire journey. He no longer needed Sora's old words to define him, since he had Mina's steady presence to define him now instead. Nearly 3 years after selling the company, Richard Voss made one of his regular visits, though this one felt different somehow. He looked thinner and moved more slowly, though his eyes remained just as sharp as they had always been. He asked to see the whole floor, walking through departments he had built decades earlier while nodding quietly at familiar faces. He stopped at Kevin's office last and sat down heavily, admitting his health had not been particularly good these past months. Kevin felt a real unexpected wave of concern, having grown genuinely fond of the old man over these past years. Richard waved off his concern gently, saying he had lived a long, full life and regretted very little of it. He said watching Kevin build on what he started had given him more peace than almost anything else recently. He said most founders worried their life's work would be gutted or forgotten once they stepped away from it. He said Kevin had proven that fear wrong by keeping the culture alive while still helping the company genuinely grow stronger. Kevin thanked him, admitting quietly that none of this would have happened without Richard's willingness to trust a total stranger. Richard told him something else that day, something Kevin would carry with him long after that particular conversation ended. He said the real measure of a life was not the size of the company or the size of the bank account. He said it was how many people you helped become steadier, more capable, and more themselves along the way somehow. He mentioned Ji-yoon by name, having heard about her growth through mentorship, saying that mattered more than any single deal. He mentioned Grace's steady leadership, saying choosing her had been one of Kevin's smartest decisions during this whole process. He mentioned Mina briefly too, saying he was glad Kevin had found someone who valued him for the right reasons. Kevin sat quietly, absorbing each observation and recognizing the weight of an old man passing down hard-earned wisdom carefully. Before leaving that day, Richard shook his hand once more with the same steady grip from that very first meeting years ago. He said he was proud, plainly and simply, without any need for further explanation or elaborate sentimental speech attached. Kevin watched him leave the building slowly, feeling a quiet gratitude that no title or paycheck could ever fully capture. 4 years after the acquisition, Kevin decided it was finally time to ask Mina to marry him, formally and completely. He did not plan anything flashy or public, remembering clearly how little he had ever valued performance over genuine substance. Instead, he planned a quiet dinner at the same small restaurant where they had first talked beyond simple work matters. He arranged for the same corner table and the same quiet lighting, wanting the moment to feel personal rather than staged. Over dinner, he told her plainly how much her steady presence had shaped the better parts of who he had become. He said she had taught him that genuine partnership meant supporting someone's growth rather than simply admiring their visible results. He proposed simply without elaborate speeches, offering her a ring and an honest promise to keep building life together patiently. Mina, moved by the simplicity and sincerity, said yes immediately, recognizing this proposal reflected everything genuine about their relationship. They celebrated quietly that night, calling only their closest friends and family while avoiding any large or performative public announcement. Priya, hearing the news, told Kevin she was thrilled and added that she had suspected this moment was coming for months already. Their wedding, planned over the following year, remained modest and meaningful, reflecting the values they had built their relationship around. They invited close friends, family, Richard Voss despite his declining health, Grace, Priya, and a handful of trusted colleagues. Sora was not invited, not out of lingering bitterness but simply because their paths no longer overlapped in any meaningful way. Kevin felt no need to include her in this chapter, understanding some relationships simply concluded without requiring further closure or gesture. Their wedding day arrived on a clear afternoon, considerably different from the cold winter evening that had once ended everything. Kevin watched Meena walk toward him, feeling genuine joy completely unlike anything he had experienced during his previous relationship. Exchanging vows, both spoke honestly about their journey while acknowledging the patience and growth required to build genuine partnership together. The small gathered crowd celebrated with authentic warmth, reflecting the hard-won meaningful nature of their entire shared story. Kevin reflected privately that evening on the remarkable distance between that cold dinner and this warm genuine celebration now. He no longer measured his life by proving anyone wrong since he measured it by moments exactly like this one instead. On the 5th anniversary of that difficult dinner, Kevin sat down and wrote a letter addressed simply to his younger self. He wrote about the pain of that night, admitting it honestly rather than pretending it had not mattered at all. He wrote that the words hurt because some part of him had quietly feared they might actually be true somehow. He wrote that fear, faced honestly instead of avoided, had eventually become the exact fuel needed to build something real. He wrote that revenge, as a goal, would have eventually felt hollow no matter how successful the plan became. Purpose, built patiently alongside that initial spark, was what had actually made the entire journey feel worthwhile in the end. He wrote about Richard's trust, about Priya's early belief, about Grace's steady partnership, and about Meena's honest, grounding presence. He wrote that none of this success belonged to him alone despite how solitary the early planning had once felt. He wrote a final line, simple and clear, meant to remind himself during any future difficult moment ahead. Being underestimated was not a life sentence since it was simply information waiting patiently to be proven wrong through action. He folded the letter carefully, placing it inside a drawer alongside a few other important meaningful personal documents. He did not write it for anyone else to read since it was only for himself during whatever future moment might need reminding. Meena found it years later, during a quiet afternoon of organizing old papers, reading it with quiet, genuine emotion. She asked him about it that evening and Kevin explained simply that he had needed to write it down once. He said sometimes the most important conversations happen with yourself, quietly and honestly, without needing anyone else to witness them. Meena agreed, saying that letter explained more about him than almost anything he had ever told her directly before. She asked if he still believed what he had written and Kevin confirmed he believed it more now than ever. Being doubted, he said, was simply the beginning of a story rather than the ending anyone assumed it would be. The real ending, he said, belonged entirely to whoever kept showing up patiently long after the doubt had been spoken. He had shown up quietly for years, and this life, this family, this peace, was the genuine result. 10 years after that cold dinner, Kevin stood before a small group of young entrepreneurs at a local mentorship event. He had been invited to share his story though he still felt slightly uncomfortable treating his own life as a lesson. He told them the short version, a painful breakup, a quiet plan, and years of careful, patient, unglamorous work. He told them the plan had started from anger though anger alone had never been strong enough to finish it. He told them purpose had to eventually replace anger or the whole structure would collapse under its own bitter weight. He told them being underestimated felt terrible in the moment though it often revealed exactly where real opportunity was hiding. He told them patience was not the same as being passive since quiet people built some of the strongest things. He told them to watch for people who believed in them early and to remember that belief for years afterward. He told them success, real success, was never about making someone regret leaving since it was about becoming someone worth staying for. He ended simply, saying his story was not really about revenge no matter how it might sound from the outside. It was about someone deciding quietly that being underestimated once did not mean staying underestimated forever after that. Sora, he mentioned briefly without using her name, had given him the push though the building had always been his own. He credited Richard for trust, Priya for belief, Grace for partnership, and Meena for the honest, steady love holding it together. He told the young entrepreneurs that their own quiet plans mattered too, even if nobody around them saw it yet. He said the world was full of people who would tell them exactly what they could never become someday. He said the only real answer to those words was patient, quiet, consistent work, repeated long after anyone else noticed. Walking off that small stage, Kevin felt the same steady calm he had carried since that very first meeting with Richard. He was no longer the man Sora had once dismissed across a restaurant table on a cold winter evening. He had simply and patiently and quietly become exactly who he was always capable of being underneath everything else all along. Her words had once ended something while his patience had built something considerably larger, steadier, and far more lasting instead. 6 years after the acquisition, June, the nervous young analyst Kevin once mentored, came to him with big news of her own. She had saved enough, researched enough, and found her own small opportunity worth pursuing outside the walls of Vantage Capital. She wanted to leave and start her own small investment fund focused on companies other people overlooked too quickly. She asked Kevin for advice, though what she really wanted was simply his honest opinion about whether she was ready. Kevin thought back to his own first meeting with Richard, the fear, the shaking hands, and the uncertain first step. He told her readiness was not really the right question to ask before starting something like this at all. He told her the real question was whether she could handle failing and still trying again the next morning. June admitted she was terrified, and Kevin told her that fear was completely normal, even necessary, before something meaningful. He said the people who felt no fear at all usually were not paying close enough attention to the stakes. He offered to invest a small amount personally, not because she needed rescuing but because he genuinely believed in her work. June left Vantage Capital a few months later, launching her own small fund with 3 other quiet, careful partners. Kevin followed her progress from a respectful distance, the same way Richard had once quietly followed his own early progress. Within 2 years her fund had built a small but genuinely solid reputation for careful, patient, well-researched investment decisions. She credited Kevin publicly during one interview, saying he had taught her that quiet people could build loud results eventually. Kevin read that interview privately, feeling a quiet satisfaction considerably different from anything his own personal success had provided. Watching someone he had mentored succeed felt like proof that his story mattered beyond his own individual personal journey. He mentioned this to Mina that evening, and she reminded him gently that this was exactly the legacy worth building. Not the money and not the title, but the quiet chain of belief passed from one person toward the next. Kevin agreed completely, recognizing this chain as the truest, most lasting outcome of everything he had built so far. He hoped someday Jiyun would mentor someone else too, continuing a pattern that had started with one nervous 15-minute meeting. One quiet weekend, Kevin found himself driving past the old apartment building where he had once lived during the breakup. He had not planned this route specifically, though something about the familiar street pulled his attention as he passed by. He parked briefly, looking up at the small window that once belonged to the apartment where everything had truly started. He remembered sitting there that night, staring at his laptop, feeling the sting of Sora's words settle into his chest. He remembered the exact moment he decided visibility was not power and structure mattered more than flashy proof. Sitting in his car now, considerably different than that younger version of himself, he felt something close to quiet gratitude. Not gratitude toward Sora specifically, but gratitude toward the version of himself who had refused to simply stay comfortable. That version had been scared, uncertain, and completely unproven, yet had chosen to try anyway, one careful step at a time. Kevin sent a quick photo of the building to Mina with a short message explaining what this place had once meant. She replied simply, saying she was proud of the person who had walked out of that apartment and kept building. Driving home afterward, Kevin thought about how strange it was that pain and opportunity often arrived wearing the same disguise. That dinner had felt, at the time, like the absolute end of something valuable and irreplaceable in his life. Looking back now, it had actually been the beginning of nearly everything meaningful he currently had in his life. He did not romanticize the pain itself, understanding clearly that cruelty was never required to create genuine lasting growth. But he had learned to recognize that sometimes growth arrived through difficult doors, whether anyone planned it that way or not. What mattered most, he had learned, was what a person chose to build once that difficult door had opened. He could have stayed bitter, could have built something driven purely by spite, and could have wasted years chasing empty revenge. Instead, he had built something real, something that had grown considerably larger than the original wound that started it. That choice, more than any single deal or title, represented the true turning point inside his entire complicated story. He arrived home that evening, greeted by Mina and their small daughter, feeling completely, quietly, and genuinely at peace. Watching his daughter grow older, Kevin often thought about what specific lessons he most wanted to eventually pass down to her. He wanted her to know that other people's opinions of her potential were simply opinions rather than permanent facts about her worth. He wanted her to know that being underestimated could feel painful, though it often revealed exactly where growth was waiting. He wanted her to know that quiet, patient work usually outlasted loud, flashy temporary impressions built for quick attention only. He wanted her to know that revenge made a poor foundation, though purpose, built carefully alongside pain, could become something solid. He wanted her to know that real partners supported her growth honestly rather than simply admiring her convenient, visible results. He wanted her to know that asking for help, the way he once asked Priya, was strength rather than weakness. He wanted her to know that trust, once earned through consistent honesty, mattered more than any single flashy achievement alone. He wanted her to know that her father had once been told he had no future worth mentioning at all. He wanted her to know that the person saying those words had simply been wrong, plainly and completely wrong. He did not want her growing up believing she needed someone's cruelty to eventually discover her own quiet strength. He hoped she would simply know her own worth early without needing years of doubt to eventually prove it clearly. But he also wanted her to understand that if doubt ever came her way, it did not have to define her. It could simply become information, a strange kind of fuel, waiting patiently to be proven wrong through steady action. He planned to tell her this whole story someday, when she was old enough to understand its full complicated shape. Not as a story about revenge, though revenge had certainly been the spark that started the entire long journey, but as a story about patience, about quiet belief, and about choosing to build rather than simply choosing to react. He hoped she would carry that lesson forward, the same way Richard had passed it down to him originally. Quiet people build lasting things while loud moments fade, since what remains is whatever was built carefully, brick by patient brick. That, more than any title, any company, or any single dinner years ago, was the real inheritance worth leaving behind. Nearly 8 years after that cold dinner, Kevin ran into Sora one final time at a small industry conference downtown. She was there representing a different company now, having moved on from Vantage Capital about a year earlier. She looked well and calm, settled into a role that seemed to actually fit her, built around steady client work. They spoke briefly and easily, the awkward tension from years earlier now replaced by simple, comfortable professional familiarity between them. She mentioned she was engaged to someone outside the finance world entirely, someone who valued her for reasons beyond ambition. Kevin congratulated her sincerely, meaning it completely, feeling genuine happiness for her that surprised him slightly in the moment. She asked about Mina and their daughter, and Kevin shared a few small warm details, proud without being showy about it. Before parting, Sora said something that stayed with him longer than she probably expected it to. She said she used to think success meant being chosen, being picked by someone powerful, and being close to the right people. Now, she said, she understood success meant building your own steady ground so you never needed anyone to pick you. Kevin nodded, recognizing that lesson as the same one he had spent nearly a decade learning himself, slowly and carefully. He told her that lesson had taken him years too, and that most people learned it the hard way eventually. She smiled, saying she was grateful in a strange way that her own hard way had happened when it did. They shook hands, wished each other well, and walked in separate directions, two people finally at peace with their history. Kevin drove home that evening thinking about how completely different this conversation felt from anything he once imagined possible. He had once pictured this moment, years earlier, as something dramatic that proved a point loudly and finally. Instead it had been quiet, plain, and genuinely kind, exactly the way most real endings actually tend to happen. There was no scoreboard, no winner declared, and no dramatic reveal of who had built the bigger, more impressive life. There was simply two people, older now and wiser now, who had each found their own steady ground eventually. That, Kevin realized, was a considerably better ending than any revenge fantasy he had once quietly imagined that first night. 10 years after founding his mentorship habit, Kevin had personally guided over a dozen young analysts through their own early careers. Several had gone on to build their own companies, their own funds, and their own quiet, steady versions of success. None of them knew the full original story behind why Kevin had started mentoring people so patiently in the first place. He never made it a big lesson or a dramatic speech, since he simply lived it consistently year after year. Grace, still leading Vantage Capital successfully, often said Kevin's quiet influence was the real reason the culture had stayed healthy. Richard Voss had passed away peacefully 2 years earlier, though his name remained on a small plaque near the entrance. Kevin visited that plaque occasionally, remembering the old man's steady voice, his simple wisdom, and his willingness to trust a stranger. He often thought that Richard's biggest gift had never been the company itself but the belief that made it possible. Belief, passed from Richard to Kevin to Ji-yoon, and from Ji-yoon to whoever she eventually chose to mentor herself. This quiet chain, invisible to anyone measuring success by titles or headlines, felt like the truest legacy worth building. Mina often told Kevin that his greatest achievement was never really the company, the title, or even the money. It was becoming someone who turned a painful, humiliating moment into a decade of consistent, patient, generous building instead. Kevin agreed, though he always added one thing whenever this specific topic came up during their quiet evening conversations. None of it would have mattered without people willing to trust him before he had proven anything at all. Priya's early belief, Richard's 15 minutes, Grace's steady partnership, Mina's honest love, and Ji-yoon's own eventual hard-won success. Each person had added something essential, something he could never have built completely alone no matter how patient he was. He had learned that even the quietest, most independent-seeming success usually rested on a foundation of other people's belief. That lesson, more than any single deal or title, shaped how he moved through the rest of his life afterward. He tried every day to be the kind of person willing to offer that same early unearned belief to someone else. Because someone had once offered it to him during his lowest, most uncertain, most quietly determined moment. Looking back on everything, Kevin sometimes thought about the exact moment Sora said he had no future worth waiting for. He no longer felt anger remembering it, since he simply felt a strange, quiet gratitude for how wrong she turned out to be. Not wrong because he got revenge, and not wrong because he built a bigger title or a fatter bank account. Wrong because a future had been there all along, quiet and patient, waiting simply to be built one careful step at a time. She had looked at a data analyst eating dinner quietly and seen nothing worth waiting for in front of her. She had missed the patience, the careful mind, and the quiet determination that would eventually reshape an entire company from within. Most people, he realized, missed exactly that in others, judging potential by volume instead of by actual underlying substance. He hoped, whenever people doubted him or anyone else in the future, they would remember this simple lesson clearly. Quiet does not mean empty, patient does not mean weak, and comfortable does not mean without ambition or genuine hidden drive. Sometimes the biggest future belongs to the person everyone else assumed had none at all. Kevin closed his laptop that evening, the same kind of laptop he had once stared at during that painful first night. Outside his window, the city lights spread out below, the same city that once held his old apartment and his old doubts. He thought of Mina upstairs, of his daughter asleep in her room, and of Vantage Capital humming quietly downtown without him tonight. He thought of Richard, of Priya, of Grace, of June, and of everyone who had shaped this long, patient journey. He thought finally of Sora, without anger and without triumph, simply as the spark that had started something much larger. She had said he had no future, while in the end her own future simply reported to a version of him she never expected. Not out of cruelty and not out of revenge, finally satisfied, since it was out of patient, honest, quietly built structure instead. He turned off the light, feeling the same steady calm that had carried him through every uncertain step of this story. Somewhere a new young analyst was probably eating a quiet dinner tonight, hearing words that felt just as dismissive. Kevin hoped, wherever that person was, they would remember that quiet people sometimes build the loudest, most lasting results. Before closing the book on this story, there is one more detail Kevin liked to mention whenever he told it fully. People often assumed Richard Voss took a wild, reckless gamble, trusting a stranger with no finance background at all. Richard always disagreed with that framing whenever the topic came up during his later, quieter years of retirement. He said he never bet on a stranger, since he bet on the quality of the questions that stranger asked him. Anyone can claim ambition, and anyone can wear a confident suit and speak with a loud, polished, rehearsed voice. Very few people show up with real research, honest uncertainty, and a willingness to admit exactly what they do not know yet. That combination, Richard said, mattered more to him than any resume, any title, or any flashy introduction ever could have. Kevin carried that distinction forward into his own mentoring, teaching young analysts to lead with honest questions rather than empty confidence. He told them bosses and investors were tired of hearing certainty, since they were hungry for someone who actually understood the problem. Understanding, he said, always beat performance eventually, even if performance won the very first 5 minutes of attention. This lesson became something of an informal motto around Kevin's small mentoring circle over the years that followed. June printed it and kept it taped inside her own office drawer, reading it during her own nervous early days. She later passed the same idea along to her own first hire, continuing the quiet chain a little further outward. Kevin never trademarked it, never turned it into a course, and never tried to monetize the lesson itself directly. He simply kept living it, teaching it person by person the same patient way everything else had been built. Some legacies come with buildings named after people, while others come with plaques and headlines and public recognition everywhere. This legacy was quieter than that, living inside conversations, inside decisions, and inside the way a handful of people learned to work. Kevin decided somewhere along the way that quieter kind of legacy suited him considerably better than the loud kind anyway. It matched everything else about how he had built his entire life, one honest, careful step after another. And in the end, that quiet, steady pattern was exactly what had made the whole difference from the very beginning. If there is one single idea worth carrying away from this whole story, it is simply this thought.